I didn't plan for it to happen. Staying late after class was supposed to be harmless. Just a chance to talk. But when Coach Miller looked at me like that, everything I thought I knew unraveled. His hand brushed mine. The air between us burned. And when our lips met, it was like the world stopped spinning. It was forbidden. It was impossible. And yet, it felt like the only thing that had ever made sense. Now I can't stop asking myself, was one moment worth risking everything? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The first thing I noticed that morning was how the air felt different. Charged. Almost alive with a quiet intensity. It wasn't something I could point out to anyone else. It was just one of those strange feelings you get in your chest. The kind that hums beneath your ribs like a song only you can hear. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't shake the sense that today was going to matter. I looked around the bustling hallway of Kensington High as students swarmed to their lockers, shouting greetings and gossiping in their little cliques. To anyone else, it was just another typical school day. But to me, the usual buzz of the morning seemed louder somehow, sharper. Every sound and movement felt like it had been turned up a notch. I shoved my books into my locker and grabbed my gym bag, trying to tune out the noise and tell myself it was nothing. Nothing. That word had followed me around for years. I wasn't the star of anything. Not the brightest in class, not the fastest on the track, not the funniest at lunch. I was just Alex, a 17-year-old guy who blended into the background and tried not to stick out too much. Still, if there was one place I felt alive, like I could be someone, it was in PE class. The gym had this energy to it, the kind that made my heart race before I even laced up my sneakers. It was loud and chaotic, full of movement and challenges, and, most importantly, it was where he was. Coach Miller. Just thinking about him made my palms sweat as I walked toward the gym. It wasn't like I planned to fixate on him, but it was impossible not to. He had this presence. I wasn't even sure how to describe it. Confidence, maybe? Charisma? Something about the way he carried himself made every word he said sound important. Like he knew exactly how to hold everyone's attention without trying too hard. He was everything I wasn't. Confident, commanding, and way too good-looking for his own good. I hated that I kept thinking about him like that. Like he was something more than a teacher, more than a coach. But it wasn't something I could turn off. Every time I saw him, my stomach twisted itself into knots. A confusing mix of nerves and excitement that left me feeling dizzy. The thought of going to PE today filled me with equal parts dread and anticipation. It was one of my favorite classes, sure, but it also meant 45 minutes of pretending I wasn't hyper-aware of every single thing Coach Miller did. The way his green eyes scanned the room. The way he clapped his hands to get our attention. The way his smile could make you feel like you just won the lottery, even if all you'd done was run a decent lap. I shoved open the door to the locker room and tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe it really was just another day. The locker room smelled like sweat and cheap deodorant, the usual mix of teenage bodies and stale air. I found my spot on the bench and started changing into my gym clothes. Around me, guys were laughing and cracking jokes, their voices bouncing off the tiled walls. It was all background noise to me. As I laced up my sneakers, I felt my chest tighten again, that strange buzzing feeling from earlier coming back stronger. I didn't know why. Maybe it was just nerves about the dodgeball game Coach had planned for today. Or maybe it was because I knew he'd be there, walking around the gym, watching us, shouting out encouragement in that voice that seemed to stick in my head long after class was over. I slung my gym bag into my locker and walked toward the gym, my heart picking up speed with every step. "Let's go, guys." I heard Coach Miller's voice before I even saw him. It was loud and confident, cutting through the noise like it was meant for me alone. When I stepped into the gym and saw him standing near the bleachers, clipboard in hand, that buzzing feeling in my chest turned into a full-on jolt. He looked the same as always, fit, relaxed, like he belonged there in a way I never could. But today, something about the way he carried himself felt different, like he was standing a little taller, smiling a little brighter. And just like that, I knew. Whatever was about to happen today wasn't going to be like every other day. There was something magnetic about the way Coach Miller moved. I didn't mean that in a poetic or abstract way. He literally pulled your eyes toward him, like you couldn't look away even if you wanted to. Standing there by the bleachers, clipboard in hand, he looked like a portrait of confidence. His broad shoulders were relaxed, his stance solid and commanding, and the way his whistle hung casually around his neck made it seem like he was born to be in charge. His dark green polo shirt clung to his frame, showing off the definition in his arms and chest as if the fabric itself knew better than to fight against him. His khaki shorts ended just above the knee, leaving his muscular calves visible, perfectly tanned, of course. He wasn't trying to show off, but that's just who he was. Every movement, every gesture, every glance seemed effortless. Like he didn't have to try to be impressive, he simply was. "All right, everyone." His voice boomed across the gym, loud but not harsh. It wasn't the kind of yelling that made you want to shrink back. No, his voice demanded attention but gave you something in return. A boost of energy, a sense of purpose. Hustle up, let's get started. We've got dodgeball today, so I hope you brought your A game. A groan rippled through the group of students, but I didn't mind. Dodgeball was one of the few sports where I could actually hold my own. I wasn't the fastest runner, and I wasn't exactly built like an athlete, but I had decent aim. And I liked the challenge of it. It was one of the rare times I could stand out, even if just a little. But even as I joined the group stretching in the center of the gym, my focus wasn't on the game. It was on him. Coach Miller walked through the group, calling out names, cracking jokes, and correcting people's form. He had this way of making everything feel light, like no matter how tired or frustrated you were, you could still smile. The other students clearly loved him for it, and I wasn't any different. When he stopped near me, my muscles tensed involuntarily. "Alex," he said, his voice breaking through the chatter like it was meant just for me. "You ready for today? You're my dark horse. I know you've got a killer arm." My stomach flipped, and I hoped my face didn't betray how much those words meant to me. I nodded quickly, trying to act normal. "Yeah, I'm ready." His lips curved into that easy, contagious smile that made his green eyes light up. "Good. I'm counting on you." And then he moved on, patting someone else on the back, completely unaware of how his words lingered long after he'd walked away. The game started a few minutes later. Balls flew across the court as students yelled and darted back and forth, ducking and weaving like their lives depended on it. I found myself hyper-focused not because of the game itself but because of him. Coach Miller stood off to the side, watching us play with that same intense, thoughtful expression he always had. He wasn't just observing, he was invested. When someone made a great play, he'd clap and call out their name. When someone fumbled, he'd shout encouragement, telling them to shake it off and try again. "Nice throw, Alex," he called when I managed to hit one of the bigger guys on the opposing team. I felt a surge of pride. Not because I'd taken someone out, but because he noticed. It was ridiculous, really. I knew that. He was just a teacher doing his job. He probably didn't even remember half the things he said to us by the end of the day. But the way he looked at me in that moment, like he actually meant it, like I wasn't just another face in the crowd, made my chest tighten. The rest of the game passed in a blur. I caught a few more players, dodged a couple of hits, and eventually ended up on the winning team. Felt good, really good, but the best part wasn't the victory. It was the way Coach Miller clapped his hands together at the end, blowing his whistle and shouting, "That's what I'm talking about. Nice work out there, Alex." I tried to play it cool as I grabbed a water bottle from the bench, but inside, I was buzzing. After the game, we all shuffled back into the locker room, laughing and complaining about sore muscles. As I changed out of my gym clothes, I found myself thinking about how Coach Miller had looked at me during the game. That sharp, focused gaze that made me feel like I mattered, even if just for a moment. I wasn't sure why his approval meant so much to me, but it did. And I couldn't ignore the fact that it wasn't just about respect or admiration. It was something deeper, something I didn't want to admit even to myself. Because whatever this was, whatever I was feeling, I knew it wasn't the kind of thing I could say out loud. The gym was alive with chaos as the dodgeball game kicked into full swing. Shouts and laughter echoed off the walls, punctuated by the sharp thwack of rubber balls hitting skin and the floor. I was somewhere in the middle of it all, dodging, ducking, and trying to keep my focus on the game, but it was impossible to ignore him. Coach Miller stood near the edge of the court, clipboard in hand, watching us with that easy smile of his. Occasionally, he'd blow his whistle to remind us of the rules or shout encouragement to the players. His voice carried effortlessly over the noise, clear and commanding, and every time I heard it, my stomach tightened just a little. "Eyes up, Alex. You're doing great," he called out, and for a second, I froze, completely thrown off by the way my name sounded coming from his mouth. A rubber ball narrowly missed my head, and I snapped back to attention, cursing myself for getting distracted. The last thing I needed was to be taken out because I couldn't keep my focus. I ducked behind one of the gym's movable barriers, wiping the sweat from my forehead as I tried to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, not just from running, but from the heat of his gaze. I could feel it, even when I wasn't looking directly at him. I knew Coach Miller was watching, and for some reason, the thought of disappointing him filled me with a strange, gnawing anxiety. It wasn't just about winning. It was about proving something to him, to myself, maybe to both of us. "Nice one, Alex." His voice rang out again, and I glanced up to see him grinning after I managed to hit one of the opposing team's players. I didn't know what it was about his encouragement that made my chest feel like it was swelling. He probably said the same thing to everyone else, but when it was directed at me, it felt different. Like it mattered more. Like I mattered more. The game dragged on, and I kept throwing, dodging, and running until my legs started to burn. Each time I landed a solid hit, I'd glance over at Coach Miller, hoping to catch that approving smile again. And each time I did, it was like a jolt of electricity, a rush of adrenaline that made me push myself harder. But it wasn't just about impressing him. It was also about the way he looked when he smiled, how it lit up his face, making his green eyes sparkle in a way that seemed almost personal. "All right, last round," Coach Miller called, blowing his whistle. "Make it count." We were down to the final few players on each team. My arms ached, and my shirt was damp with sweat, but I wasn't about to give up. Not when I knew he was still watching. I grabbed a ball from the ground, gripping it tightly as I lined up my shot. One of the guys on the opposing team, a tall, muscular kid named Brandon, was weaving back and forth like he thought he was untouchable. I narrowed my eyes, took a deep breath, and launched the ball as hard as I could. It hit him square in the chest, and the sound it made was so satisfying I couldn't help but grin. Brandon stumbled back, scowling as he stomped off to the sidelines, and a cheer erupted from my team. "Hell yeah, Alex!" one of my teammates shouted, clapping me on the back. But the real victory came when I turned my head and saw Coach Miller smiling at me. Not the quick, polite kind of smile he gave everyone else, but a real one, wide and genuine, like he was actually proud of me. "Nice throw," he said, giving me a thumbs up. For a split second, I forgot about the game entirely. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the noise around me. I wanted to say something back, to thank him, to tell him how much those words meant to me, but all I could do was nod and hope he saw how much I appreciated it. The whistle blew a few minutes later, signaling the end of the game. My team had won, but I barely registered the victory. The only thing I could focus on was how Coach Miller clapped his hands together, his voice ringing out as he congratulated us. "Great work, everyone," he said, his eyes sweeping over the group. When they landed on me, I felt a jolt of pride so intense it almost hurt. "Alex, you were on fire out there. Keep it up." I felt my face flush, and I quickly looked down, pretending to adjust the strap on my water bottle. My heart was still racing as we shuffled toward the locker room, everyone talking and laughing about the game. Inside, I peeled off my gym clothes, the familiar smell of sweat and deodorant filling the air as I threw my shirt into my bag. But even as I went through the motions, my mind was stuck on those words. "You were on fire out there. Keep it up." For someone like me, who had spent most of high school blending into the background, those words felt monumental. Like they meant something. And the thing was, they did. The gym was quiet now, the chaos of the dodgeball game replaced by the faint echo of distant voices from the hallway. Most of the students had already filed out, heading for their next classes or to grab water from the vending machines before the bell rang. But I wasn't in a rush to leave. I stood near the bleachers, pretending to adjust the strap on my gym bag. My heart was still racing from the game, not just from running and throwing, but from everything else. From him. Coach Miller was over by the equipment rack, carefully stacking the dodgeballs back into the wire cage and locking it with a padlock. His movements were unhurried, precise, like he wasn't just putting things away but organizing his thoughts at the same time. He hadn't noticed me lingering yet, and for a moment, I considered just walking out. But I didn't. Something held me back. Maybe it was the way my chest still felt tight, like there was something unsaid that I didn't even know how to put into words. Maybe it was just the thought of being near him for a few extra minutes. I didn't know. What I did know was that I couldn't bring myself to leave just yet. "You're hanging back a bit, Alex." Coach Miller's voice broke the silence, startling me. He wasn't looking at me, he was still crouched by the rack, adjusting the balls to fit neatly into the cage. "Everything okay?" Yeah," I said quickly, clearing my throat. I guess I wanted to thank you for, what you said earlier, during the game." He glanced up then, his green eyes locking onto mine. There was a moment of silence, just a fraction of a second, but it felt like it stretched forever. Then he stood up, brushing his hands on his khaki shorts. "I meant it," he said, his voice warm but firm. "You did a great job out there today. I could tell you were giving it your all." I nodded, suddenly feeling awkward under his gaze. I glanced down at the gym floor, scuffed and worn from years of sneakers pounding across it. "Thanks. That means a lot." Coach Miller stepped closer, just enough to close the distance between us without it feeling intentional. He wasn't towering over me, but his presence felt bigger somehow, like it filled the space between us. "You've got a lot of potential, Alex," he said, his tone softer now. "You just need to believe in yourself a little more. You're capable of more than you think." Those words hit me harder than they should have. I didn't even know how to respond. No one ever talked to me like that. Not like they saw me, like they really believed in me. I looked up at him, searching for something to say, but my throat felt tight. All I could manage was a weak, "Thanks. I'll try to work on that." He smiled then, that easy, effortless smile that made his whole face light up. Good. I'd like to see you push yourself more. You're a good kid, Alex. Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise. The words lingered in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I didn't know if it was just me imagining it, but something about the way he said them felt personal. Like he wasn't just talking about dodgeball or PE class but something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. I felt his hand on my shoulder then. Just a brief, casual gesture, but it sent a shiver down my spine. His palm was warm, solid, the weight of it both grounding and overwhelming at the same time. You'd better get going before the bell rings, he said, his voice lighter now, almost teasing. Don't want you getting detention on my account. Right? I said quickly, forcing myself to move, to sling my gym bag over my shoulder and take a step back. Thanks again, coach. Anytime, Alex, he replied, his smile softening. I turned and headed for the locker room, my legs feeling like they were moving on autopilot. My thoughts were spinning, tangled in ways I couldn't quite sort out. His words, his smile, that brief touch. They replayed in my head over and over, like a song I couldn't get out of my mind. As I pushed open the locker room door, I realized I didn't want this feeling to go away. The locker room was almost empty when I walked in. Most of the guys had already finished changing and left, their laughter and conversation fading into the hallway outside. I took my time heading to my locker, unzipping my gym bag and pulling out my towel and body wash. My movements felt mechanical, my mind still caught on the words Coach Miller had said to me in the gym just minutes ago. You're a good kid, Alex. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The way he said it, with that look in his eyes like he meant it, had lodged itself deep in my chest. I couldn't stop replaying it. I didn't know why it hit me so hard, but it did. I made my way to the showers, the tiled floor cool under my feet as I stepped into the farthest stall. The metal dividers felt cold to the touch as I hooked my towel onto the small peg, the faint hiss of the water echoing around me as I twisted the handle and let the spray come to life. The water was warm, a soothing contrast to the tension that still coiled in my chest. I leaned my forehead against the cool tile, letting the steam rise around me as I tried to make sense of everything. Why did it matter so much? Why did he matter so much? I squeezed some soap into my hands, the sharp citrus scent cutting through the fog in my head. It wasn't just admiration. I knew that much. Admiration didn't make your heart race every time someone said your name. It didn't make your stomach flip when they smiled at you. This was something else. Something I didn't even want to admit to myself. The sound of the locker room door creaking open snapped me out of my thoughts. I froze, my pulse spiking as footsteps echoed against the tile. I quickly rinsed the soap off, keeping my back to the stall entrance as I listened. Alex! My heart nearly stopped. I turned slowly, blinking against the spray of water. Standing just outside the row of showers was Coach Miller, his silhouette outlined by the fluorescent lights. His voice was calm, casual, but there was something in his expression, concern, maybe? Or was it hesitation? Coach? I managed, my voice breaking slightly as I reached for my towel and wrapped it around my waist. My mind was spinning, trying to figure out why he was here. Why now? Sorry to bother you, he said, stepping a little closer but staying just outside the threshold of the shower area. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his shorts, his posture relaxed, but his gaze flicked toward me like he was trying to gauge my reaction. I just noticed you were still here and wanted to make sure everything's okay. You've been kind of quiet today. Quiet? Was that all this was? A teacher checking in on his student? I'm fine, I said quickly, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. I just needed a second to cool off after the game. That's all. He nodded, his expression softening. You sure? You've been pushing yourself pretty hard lately. I swallowed, the steam around me suddenly feeling suffocating. Yeah, I'm good. Really. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The only sound was the faint drip of water from the showerhead behind me. His eyes lingered on me a little longer than I expected, and for some reason, that made my skin prickle. You don't have to be so hard on yourself, you know? He said finally, his voice quieter now. You're doing better than you think. His words felt like a punch and a hug at the same time, knocking the air out of me while wrapping me in something warm. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Coach Miller glanced at the floor for a second, then back up at me. He gave me a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening. All right, he said after a beat. I'll let you finish up. Just don't hesitate to talk to me if something's bothering you. Okay? I nodded again, too overwhelmed to trust my voice. See you tomorrow, Alex, he said as he turned to leave, his footsteps echoing as he walked out of the locker room. When the door swung shut behind him, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My heart was still racing, my thoughts spinning like a carousel I couldn't get off. I stood there for what felt like forever, water dripping down my skin as I stared at the empty doorway where he'd been. There was something in the way he'd looked at me, something in the way he'd spoken, that I couldn't shake. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't nothing. The next morning, I could barely keep my focus in class. The encounter in the locker room yesterday played on a constant loop in my mind, each detail sharpened by memory. The way Coach Miller looked at me, the way his words sounded calm, warm, and yet layered with something else I couldn't quite name. I didn't want to read too much into it, but the way his eyes lingered felt different. By the time PE rolled around, my heart was pounding in anticipation. I tried to act normal as I walked into the gym, my bag slung over my shoulder. Coach Miller stood near the bleachers, clipboard in hand as usual, his green eyes scanning the room as students filed in. For a moment, I thought I saw his gaze flick to me, but it was so brief I couldn't be sure. The class passed in a blur. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Not the drills, not the game we were playing, not even the banter between the other students. All I could think about was him, the weight of his presence, the tension that seemed to hang in the air every time he glanced in my direction. When the whistle finally blew, signaling the end of class, I lingered again, pretending to organize my bag while everyone else filtered out. My heart was racing, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. I watched as Coach Miller started tidying up, rolling a basketball toward the rack and tossing a stray water bottle into the trash can. He hadn't noticed me yet. Or maybe he had and was just giving me time. "Need something, Alex?" he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I froze, my hands tightening on the strap of my bag. No. I was just taking my time, I guess." He turned toward me, one eyebrow raised, but there was no judgment in his expression. If anything, he looked curious. "You've been quiet today," he said, his tone gentle. "That's not like you." I hesitated, my mouth dry. "I've just been thinking a lot, I guess." Coach Miller nodded, stepping closer. "Anything you want to talk about?" The question hung between us, heavier than it should have been. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to tell him how much his words yesterday had meant to me, how they'd stayed with me all night. I wanted to tell him how much his approval meant, how much he meant, but I couldn't. "It's nothing," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Alex." His voice softened, and I felt his hand on my shoulder. Gentle, reassuring, but firm enough to make me look up. His green eyes were steady, filled with something I couldn't quite name. Concern? Understanding? Something else entirely? "You don't have to keep everything to yourself," he said quietly. "I'm here. Okay? Whatever it is, you can talk to me." The lump in my throat grew tighter, and before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. "Why do you care so much?" It was a stupid question. I knew it the second it left my mouth. He was a teacher, it was literally his job to care about his students. But the way he looked at me in that moment made it feel like there was more to it than that. For a second, he didn't answer. He just looked at me, his eyes searching mine like he was trying to figure out how much to say. Finally, he exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just do." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I wanted to say something, but the words were stuck in my throat. The air between us felt thick, electric, like it was charged with something neither of us could name. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. All I knew was that one moment we were standing there, the weight of unspoken words between us, and the next, his lips were on mine. The kiss was hesitant at first, like we were both waiting for the other to pull away. But when neither of us did, it deepened, his hand sliding from my shoulder to the back of my neck. I could feel the warmth of his breath, the faint taste of mint as his lips moved against mine. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were wide, his expression a mix of shock and regret. He started, but I cut him off. "It's okay," I said quickly, my voice shaking. "It's okay." He took a step back, running a hand over his face. "Alex, this can't happen. You know that, right?" I nodded, but the words felt hollow. I didn't want to believe them. I didn't want this moment to end. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft. "I shouldn't have." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice stronger now. "Don't apologize." For a moment, he just looked at me, like he was trying to decide what to say. But in the end, he just nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Go get changed," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned and walked toward the locker room, my legs feeling like they might give out at any second. My mind was spinning, my heart still racing from the kiss that had changed everything. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the press of his lips against mine. It wasn't just the kiss itself. It was everything leading up to it. The way he'd looked at me, the hesitation in his voice, the unspoken weight of what we'd done. It didn't feel real. And yet, when I walked into the gym the next day, there he was, Coach Miller, standing by the bleachers with his usual clipboard. From a distance, he looked the same as always. Calm, confident, and in control. But when his eyes flicked to mine for the briefest moment, I saw it. That crack in his composure. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But I knew it was there because I felt it too. I tried to keep my head down during class, sticking to the background as much as possible. It wasn't that I didn't want to be near him, quite the opposite. I just didn't trust myself to act normal. My thoughts were too loud, my chest too tight. And yet, every time he called out instructions or glanced my way, I felt the same pull, the same connection I couldn't explain. After class, I stayed behind again, even though part of me knew I shouldn't. My heart pounded as I packed up my bag, taking my time while the other students left. I didn't know what I was expecting, or hoping for. Maybe just a chance to talk, to figure out what the hell was happening between us. Coach Miller was at the far end of the gym, putting equipment away like he always did. I hesitated for a moment before walking over, my footsteps echoing against the polished floor. When he saw me approaching, he straightened, wiping his hands on his shorts. "Alex," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You need something?" I stopped a few feet away, clutching the strap of my bag like it was a lifeline. I wanted to talk," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended. He sighed, glancing around the empty gym before gesturing toward the bleachers. "All right," he said, his tone guarded. "Let's sit." We sat down side by side, the metal bleachers cool beneath me. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched on, heavy and awkward, until I finally broke it. "About yesterday," I started, my throat dry. I don't know what to say, but I can't stop thinking about it." His shoulders tensed, and he ran a hand through his hair. "Alex, I shouldn't have let that happen," he said, his voice low. "It was a mistake." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked down at my hands, my chest tightening. "It didn't feel like a mistake," I said quietly. He turned to me then, his green eyes full of conflict. "That's not the point," he said. "It doesn't matter how it felt. What matters is that it can't happen again." "But why?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. I met his gaze, my voice shaking. "Why does it have to be like this? I know it's complicated. I know it's wrong. But I also know you feel it too." He stared at me, his jaw tightening. "Alex, this isn't about what I feel," he said. "It's about what's right. About what's safe. For you. For me. But what if? There are no what ifs." He cut me off, his voice sharper now. "You don't understand the kind of risk we're talking about here. This could ruin everything." I swallowed hard, my throat burning. "I don't care about the risks," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You should care," he said, his tone softening. "Because I do. Alex, I care about you. That's why this has to stop." My heart felt like it was breaking, even as his words filled me with a strange, fragile hope. He did care about me. I wasn't imagining it. I trailed off, struggling to find the words. "I don't want this to end." He looked at me, and for a moment, I thought he might say something. But instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was fleeting, tentative, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "Alex," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know how much I wish things were different." I wanted to say something, to tell him that I didn't care about anything but us. But before I could, he pulled his hand back, standing up and running a hand over his face. "We can't do this," he said again, his voice strained. "I'm sorry." And with that, he walked away, leaving me sitting there on the bleachers, my chest aching with everything I couldn't say. The walk home that day felt heavier than usual. My backpack dug into my shoulders, but it wasn't the weight of books dragging me down. It was everything that had happened. Everything that wasn't supposed to happen. I kept replaying the moment on the bleachers in my head. The way Coach Miller had looked at me, like he wanted to say something more but couldn't bring himself to. The way his hand had brushed mine, as if he couldn't stop himself even though he knew he should. And then the way he'd walked away, leaving me there with a hollow ache in my chest. He cared about me. He'd said it outright. But knowing that didn't make it any easier. If anything, it made it worse. I dropped my bag on the floor as soon as I got to my room, collapsing onto my bed and staring up at the ceiling. The quiet of my house was suffocating, and I wished for the noise of the gym, for the sound of his voice cutting through the air like it always did. But instead, all I had was silence and the echo of his words running through my head. "You don't understand the kind of risk we're talking about here. This could ruin everything." He was right. Of course, he was right. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly how wrong this was, how dangerous, and yet, none of that seemed to matter when I was around him. When he looked at me like that, when he smiled at me, or called my name, or told me I was capable of more than I thought. How was I supposed to just forget all of that? How was I supposed to act like none of it had happened? The next few days were torture. I tried to avoid him during class, keeping my head down and focusing on anything else. But it was impossible. No matter how hard I tried to block him out, my eyes kept drifting to where he stood, clipboard in hand, or walking across the gym, his voice booming as he shouted instructions. And every time our eyes met, even for the briefest second, I felt that same pull, that same ache in my chest. After class on Friday, I stayed behind again, even though part of me knew I shouldn't. It was like a habit I couldn't break, even though I knew it would only make things harder. "Alex," Coach Miller said as I walked up to him. He sounded tired, like he already knew what I was going to say. I hesitated, looking down at the floor. "I don't know how to move on from this," he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You have to," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We both do." I nodded, even though it felt like my heart was splitting in two. "It's just hard," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His expression softened, and for a moment, I thought he might reach out to me again. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped back, putting more space between us. "I know it's hard," he said. "But you're strong, Alex. Stronger than you realize." The words felt like a double-edged sword. They were meant to comfort me, but they only made the ache in my chest worse. "Is this the end?" I asked, my voice cracking. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his green eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Finally, he sighed. "For now, it has to be," he said. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to nod. "Okay," I said, even though it wasn't okay. Coach Miller gave me a small, sad smile. "Take care of yourself, Alex." And then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the empty gym, my chest hollow and my heart heavier than ever. The gym was completely empty now, the echo of Coach Miller's footsteps still ringing in my ears. I stayed behind for a long time, sitting on the bleachers where everything had unraveled just days before. I stared at the glossy wood floors, scuffed and worn from years of games and drills, and tried to ignore the weight sitting in my chest. This was it. This was how it ended. When I finally stood up and grabbed my bag, the world outside felt sharper somehow, like the cold January air was trying to snap me back to reality. The walk home felt surreal, like I wasn't fully present in my own body. My legs carried me forward, step after step, but my mind was somewhere else. I kept replaying his words in my head. "Take care of yourself, Alex." The way he'd said them wasn't dismissive or cold. It was the opposite, actually, gentle, like he genuinely meant it. But there was something final in his voice too, like he decided that this was the only way forward for both of us. When I got home, I kicked off my shoes and dropped my bag by the door, letting it slump against the wall. I climbed the stairs to my room in a haze, shutting the door behind me as I collapsed onto my bed. The ceiling stared back at me, blank and unchanging, as my thoughts churned. I knew I should let it go, move on, forget. But how do you forget someone who made you feel seen for the first time in your life? That was what it came down to, wasn't it? He'd made me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't just another face in the crowd. And now he was gone. The next week at school felt like going through the motions. I showed up to class, did the work, and avoided eye contact whenever I could. But PE was the hardest part. Coach Miller was still there, standing at the front of the gym like nothing had happened. He called out instructions, gave encouragement, and clapped when someone scored a point during a game. He was the same as he'd always been, calm, confident, and in control. But he wasn't, not really, because every now and then, when he thought no one was looking, I caught the cracks in his facade. The way his shoulders tensed when our eyes met. The way he'd hesitate before calling out my name, as if the word itself had become too heavy. He was trying to move on too. I knew it was for the best. He'd made that clear. But the thing about knowing something and feeling it are two entirely different things. On Friday afternoon, as the last bell rang, I found myself standing in the parking lot, staring at the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that were almost too bright to look at. And for the first time all week, I felt something shift inside me. Not closure. Exactly, just a sense that maybe this wasn't the end after all. Maybe it was just the beginning of something else. I didn't know what that meant yet, but as I stood there, feeling the cool breeze brush against my skin, I realized I didn't have to know. Not yet, because for the first time in a long time I felt hopeful.